All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for turning on the recording. I'm going to go ahead and call this sixth work session on the alcohol tax to order. If we can go ahead and do a roll call of assembly members, please.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
And Ms. Zalatal.
Here.
Okay.
Thank you. As normal, if members want to get in the queue, please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. So as I have explained previously, this work session was originally planned for last week, but was moved to today to allow the administration and the assembly more time to collaborate and figure out a new path forward with the alcohol tax allocations. So with that, I'm excited to see what has come forward, and we'll turn it over to the administration for a presentation, and then we'll have an open discussion. We have plenty of time today. This is noticed until 2:10 p.m., so plenty of time to get into the details. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Buckestead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and give me momentarily. I'm going to share my screen. I have only 4 or 5 slides that I will run through. But as you described, the administration did propose in its budget allocations for the alcohol tax. I think, as we mentioned and Lance mentioned a few times, that was kind of an opening proposal. We all understood that this was a new revenue source that we were all dealing with for the first time, and I think from the administration's perspective, we knew that there was going to be changes to be made, and certainly I appreciate all of the conversations that we have had, not just with the Assembly over the last several weeks, but the broader community as well. So with that, I do want to just kind of take us back down memory lane a little bit and describe for those that might be listening in the actual ballot language and where the municipality said that they were going to be dedicating these funds. So what you see on your screen is the approved language from the ordinance that put this onto the ballot. And as you can see, there are 3 distinct buckets as to where funds can be spent. I'm going to expand that a little bit in the presentation and talk about 4 different buckets, but I will explain why I'm doing that. But first, the 3 big ones: funding for police, related criminal justice, and first responders. The second was to combat and address child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence. And then the third was kind of a large one that revolved around substance misuse treatment prevention programs, detoxification, long-term addiction recovery facilities, mental and behavioral health programs, and also resources to prevent and address Anchorage's homelessness issue. So those are the 3 big buckets, but I do want to draw everyone's attention to the language up top and why I'm going to say there are kind of 4 buckets. The 4th one is obviously much, much smaller, but I do want to describe it a little bit, which is there are certain administrative costs that are going to be associated with navigating and collecting, auditing, administering this new tax. So that is what I'm considering the 4th kind of bucket, are those administrative costs that we also said would be paid for through the proceeds of the alcohol tax. So What I wanted to share on the first screen, I know this is probably a little hard to read. I'm going to go through this individually and break it down in much smaller formats in the next couple of slides. But essentially, what we tried to do was break it down into these 4 different buckets. So we have the administrative collections, the first responders, homelessness, mental health, substance abuse, and then child abuse, sexual assault. And what I'm going to talk about is there were certain assembly recommendations. There was the administration proposal that was included in the budget. And then the final one where you see up at the top, the S version. And I'm just referring to that as that is this possible new S version proposal that I'll probably talk more about, and where I think a lot of the discussion will be in terms of are there some additional changes we would like to see. So let me get into some of these others. So as I said, the first one, the much smaller bucket, is the administrative costs. What does that look like? There's about a little over $250,000 for administrative costs. Most of that is within the Treasury Department. They have, I believe, the need to hire 2 additional employees to both enforce and collect on this tax, and that's what you see there, $206,000. The other number here that you will see is the $50,000. One of the other elements of the ordinance that was put before voters in the ballot language requires that the mayor and his administration provide a report to the assembly or at least 120 days before the end of the fiscal year, that details and itemizes each of the authorized uses or purpose of the expenses, and certainly we look at that and say there will be some added cost and personnel that it's going to be necessary to again make that a reality. So the assembly recognized that in kind of their initial proposal at about $50,000. As you can see, I have both the administration and the assembly as the municipal department, because I do believe that once the administration presents that there will likely be a need and a desire for the assembly to also do some education and potential reporting on there. So that is a number that we believe will work, and that's why you get to the $256,000 number. The other one that I'm going to talk about under the administrative cost, just because it doesn't necessarily fit neatly within each of the other 3 buckets, but I still consider somewhere in there, is there are going to be additional costs, particularly within AHD, because of the need to administer, as we discussed some of the other programs, a lot of the grants that are in there. So as you can see, there's about a little over $300,000 to hire a couple of individuals, mainly an accountant, a grant acquisition and a contracting officer, as well as a senior office associate. And then obviously for the, you have certain non-labor costs that go along with that. And again, I wouldn't say that these are true administrative costs in terms of collecting or enforcing the tax, but they are certainly administrative costs that the administration is going to see to be able to actually implement and ensure that the money that is going to be approved in some of these programs is properly accounted for and also pushed out in a timely fashion. So that's what that looks like. It's a little over, as you can see, a little over $500,000 just in here. So a very small portion of the overall revenue. The next one is what I would consider the first responder bucket very generally. And there are really 3 key aspects here, based on conversations that we have had. There's been a real desire to stand up or create more of a mental health first responders unit. As you can see, initially that was not included in the administration's recommendation, and in the S version, after conversations, we've landed on about a $2 million number. there is some APD personnel in the amount of about $650,000. We're still talking with APD and Chief Dahl about what the highest and best use of that is to actually get to the real drivers in terms of what I think most people envision the alcohol tax is used for. I think the initial thought is that there's some real need for some non-sworn staff to potentially really upgrade the amount of work that APD personnel can do. But we will certainly over the next couple of days get more detail on that. But that's kind of, I think, where we are landing in terms of some funding for APD. And then the final one is one that I believe you've also heard quite a bit about, and I know Sarah Stanley has presented before at least one work session, is the need to add an additional prosecutor that would be dedicated to domestic violence cases, and along with that, a clerk that would again assist with a lot of the domestic violence cases. And then again, with some of these, you'll see kind of what I consider there's always going to be some non-labor costs that go along with that. So about $350,000, that was the proposal that Sarah Stanley presented to you. And that is what kind of the first responder bucket looks like. It's about $3 million. So not quite a third, but close to, and I think gets really close to I think where both the administration and the assembly I think wanted to get in this bucket. So, and Mr. Chair, I'll ask the question: do you want me to just go through this? Would you like me to stop after each one to see if there are questions? I'm open to either.
Yeah. So what I'll do is, if there are folks in the queue, if we could do them at the end of slides, that would be great. So do you have anything else on this slide?
I don't, no.
Okay, got it. Then Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So the last I talked with folks at the health department, they were concerned that they didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the equipment and staffing for the mental health first responders. Why was the determination to maintain it there and not put it into a department that has more kind of infrastructure?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I think that might just be an oversight of me not catching this in the proposal. I don't believe, and certainly there are some assembly members we have discussed with this, but I believe that the municipal department would actually be AFD, at least in the short term. So that might just be an oversight on my part.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify.
Thanks. Want to note for the record, we've been joined by Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note for Mr. Constant, I think we're all on the same page. Obviously, this is something Ms. Zolotel and myself have really been working on in our conversations with the administration over the last week. I think we have also settled on the core team, and I believe that our consultant will as well, although we haven't gotten the final call on that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, please continue, Mr. Buckenstead.
Okay, great. So the next bucket is kind of the child abuse, sexual assault, domestic violence prevention. As you can see, this bucket totals a little over $4 million. In really the two really big ones, I think the Assembly is very well aware of, and that is essentially the evidence-based grants to providers both on the child abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence side of the ledger, as well as some early education grants to really get at some of the key drivers that drive some of these issues. And then you can see the two smaller ones. The first one is the early literacy specialist. I think the only difference in the Assembly recommendation, the administration recommendation on that is we have the exact cost on what the total cost is for an employee to do this, and I think we just refine that a little bit more. And the final one that I might do a phone a friend right now. I don't know if either Heather or Nicole Lebo are on, but I would invite them to more accurately describe what this is. And I'll pause for just a second to see if either one of them are on. If not, we can follow up with them later.
Specifically for the child abuse, the 44,000?
Yes.
Yes, so that is to reinstate grants that go to some of our providers to a previous level that the health department used to provide support to them at. And we lost some funding due to a state grant that went away. And so it's increasing those grants back to the level that they once were. Which is an increase of about $5,000 to those providers.
Okay, thanks, Heather.
Yeah.
And then really I think the only difference that you'll see based on the assembly recommendation versus the S version is on the early education grants. You can see there's about a $500,000 decrease. And I think really the only reason behind that is, I mean, I think for a lot of these programs, I think all of us agree we would like to have more to put towards them. And I think this was just a matter as we continue to go through everything else, figuring out where do we kind of fit some of the other things. So that's really the only reason that was decreased from 2.5 to 2 million. But obviously you can see there's an increase from the administration's initial proposal of $1 million to each of those programs. And I'll just circle back that this is really the reason why for these particular programs, why on the first slide on the administrative costs, there's some additional positions necessary within AHD, because we're going to be dropping about $4 million worth of grant work and other items into their lap. So we want to make sure that they have the ability to administer all of those items in a quick and efficient way. So that's all I have for this side. As you can see, it's about a little over $4 million, so about a little bit more than a third. But I'll pause before I move on to the last bucket and see if there are any questions.
Thank you. I'm going to note for the record we've been joined by Ms. Allard. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we know, and it might be something we have to follow up on, the interplay between this particular grant through the health department and the larger request from the municipal prosecutor's office, how those either work together or separately? I guess I'm a little bit, excuse me, confused or just unfamiliar with this program, and the description isn't helping me enough to know more about it and how it might work with the other funding. Thanks.
You mean the through the chair, Assembly Member Zalatel, you mean the 44,000, the final one, the bottom one?
Yes, that's correct.
Heather, could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yes, and actually I might turn that to Ms. Lebo, who is also on the call and has greater detail to provide.
Thank you, and I can get you something written here by the end of the day. We don't have a program manager actually for this right now, but I know enough to say that we fund 3 service providers. That's STAR, Awake, and Victims for Justice. And then also we work alongside to fund a position out of the out of the municipal prosecutor's office to do some pre-trial work with victims, as well as an APD officer. And some of those funds had come from a state grant in the past and had been taken away from us. We got some funds put into our regular operating dollars. And so that's already there in our budget, but the difference, this is the difference to bring us back up to what we have been functioning with that program for the last few years, so that no one would see a decrease.
Great, thank you. So the reason I asked the question is because when we have to report out, should this stay in the budget, we need to report out how these dollars worked. And so if we are actually using these dollars as grants, great. If we're actually using them to help continue funding for an APD officer and a clerk, those are two different things and two different sets of metrics we would have to report out. So I guess I would just ask that we refine what that description is. I get the overall program now. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. We can refine that a little bit more and make it more clear as we move through this process over the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. Yeah. 2 times I heard on this slide that the $5,000 reinstatement, and also in the bottom corner, the reinstate remainder of APD officer and DOL clerk. Isn't that running awfully close to the restriction that the funds wouldn't be used to cover other expenses that were already budgeted, or somehow, or is this just, am I reading that wrong? Because if it's a small enough number, we should find other funds.
Through the chair, Assemblymember Constant, I don't think that it runs afoul, but I will certainly raise that question with Ms. Vogel and the municipal attorney. I know we've talked with her about a couple of the other areas in particular, but I will certainly raise that question with her and get back to you shortly.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I was about to mention that, Ms. Zolotel. Mr. Bockenstead, is this presentation, did you email it to the clerk's office?
Oh, no, I will do that as soon as I get done with it and have it sent out. Okay,
great. So for members of the public, this presentation will be available on our work sessions page later today. Thank you. All right, go ahead, Mr. Bockenstead.
Okay. So then the final one is the mental health, substance misuse, and homelessness prevention bucket. Bottom line, this one's about 4.3 million, so a little over a third again. And as we go through this, you'll see that a lot of them line up, and some of them have been dropped for a variety of reasons, and I'll be happy to discuss those. But kind of running through from top to bottom, as you can see, the first one, there's really not any change between the Assembly and Administration's recommendation. This is essentially providing the additional necessary funding to allow overnight shelter for 150 individuals for the full year. If you remember, last year when the Assembly approved the budget, there was money included in there, but it would only cover, I believe, 8 or 9 months. So this amount would allow us to cover overnight shelter for 150 individuals for the full year. The second one on here is the day engagement in shelter. Obviously, we've had a lot of conversations around this. I would say that based on our understanding right now of kind of where we are, and I presented to the Assembly and the public, is that on the day engagement side, we have firm commitments from the Rasmussen Foundation to fund the operational costs on the day engagement center side for at least the next 3 years. So this $1 million would be more dedicated to the operational costs of, say, the new Alaska Club when that becomes operational. And certainly as we go through some of these in terms of the operating of some of the properties that we were looking at purchasing, there are other funding sources, I think, as we have described to you, to include federal grant programs, other philanthropic contributions, and additional CARES Act funding that wasn't a part of the $156 million that I think we've had a lot of conversations around. On the next one, the library social worker support, you can see that we had 215 in the Assembly and 300 in the Administration, and both of those are The only reason there's a difference there is, again, putting in the exact dollar amount for salaries and things like that for the exact positions that I think were part of the assembly recommendation. You will see that it is not included in the S version here for the alcohol tax this year. And I will say that the main reason why is, again, I will bring us back to the conversation and the debate that we've had around the CARES Act. And one of the aspects that you will, if you remember, in the approved appropriations of that money was, I believe, roughly $2.4 million for additional personnel within HD. We believe that we have not actually spent any of that money to date, mainly because a lot of the positions that we are talking about here, and you'll see as we move through this, still qualify for the FEMA public assistance. So to the extent that there are positions and funds that we can still charge there, we will continue to do so. So that $2.4 million is still available for us, and it is part of the fund balance now. That was one of the programs that was put into the fund balance. So we will have that funding next year to be able to fund all of these positions for next year. And then certainly going into 2022, there will have to be a discussion about what does the alcohol tax look like. And as we get towards the end, I will just say that the projected revenue for 21 is, if you remember, only 11 months because the tax doesn't go into effect until February 1st. So in 2022 and beyond, we will actually see an increase in the amount that we bring in because it will be for the full year. So there will still be additional money or additional revenue that you can allocate in 2022 and beyond to cover some of the gaps that we're going to be funding in other ways going forward. So just continuing to go down again, year-round camp abatement. There's no difference. I think all of us are aligned that about $700,000 to provide and expand camp abatement to year-round, and this would also include storage. The next one, the housing support for permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, the assembly recommendation was $1 million, but as you will see further down, I think that lines up pretty closely with the program that was recently approved, the Pay for Success housing program that is really designed to get people into more permanent supportive housing. So we're not including that in the S version because we believe it'll be taken care of within the Pay for Success. The year-round homelessness outreach, again, the assembly recommendation was $432,000. We don't have that in the S version, and I might get this a little wrong, so I may again ask Ms. Lebo to jump in if I do. But my understanding is that there is a pretty large chunk of federal grant funding that we have received that is available for use for this particular aspect. And with that, I might ask her to just jump in and tell us what that number is.
Currently, we have earmarked some of our CARES Act CV funds at around $2 million, and we have almost $2 million more that needs to be allocated, and some of it could go to this if necessary. So, but currently, over the next 2 years, we have that. And as long as FEMA is reimbursing the emergency shelter operations at the Sullivan, all of those other monies would be going towards whatever other shelter we can open up in the meanwhile.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one down is the treatment center operations. You will see that it's $2 million for both, and I think part of that was, at least from my understanding and my perspective, is I think that there was when I think we put this proposal forward, I think we combined both the treatment center and kind of some of the homelessness related things. So that is why the $2 million in our view is, I think, a little too large for what we're ultimately going to be needed to operationalize a new treatment center. I think, as many people remember, during the discussion and the debate around the property acquisition, we heard from Mike Abbott in the Mental Health Trust, as well as some other philanthropic partners, that specifically around this program, the treatment center, that they were going to be ready and willing to provide support on the operational side. That is where they feel that they are of most value. So we still think that there will be some need for some alcohol tax revenue to ensure that all the operational costs are met. But again, I think because we have gotten some commitments from our philanthropic partners to pay for some of those costs, that the $500,000 number is probably more in line with where we need to be going forward. The next one is obviously, as I mentioned, the Pay for Success housing program that the Assembly recently approved. If you remember, I think the total program was $4.5 million over the course of 3 years. So this would essentially be paying for the first year of those costs, and $1.8 million is the upper end. That is if we are 100% successful in every single category that has been agreed to in this program. So if we were less successful, that number would obviously go down, but 1.8 million is the upper limit. And then the last two, again, I'll kind of lump in with what I described earlier. A lot of these positions that we are discussing here were part of that $2.4 million that we had discussed and was approved by the Assembly within the CARES Act. And as I said, we have not spent any of that money to date because we are pushing it to our FEMA public assistance pile. So we know that we have the necessary funding to be able to fully fund all of these positions going into next year. But that is kind of the final bucket. Total amount is a little over 4 million. So it's a little over a third of the total amount. And I will just pause and see if there are any questions before I just go back to the last slide, which is simply just the big overview slide that I started with.
Thanks. Have a couple folks in the queue. Ms. Zalato?
I was just letting the reverberation stop. Thank you. So on the outreach piece, we currently have outreach in place, and it took us quite a while to get effective outreach, homelessness outreach going. I'm a little concerned, not necessarily if it's not in the alcohol tax, but I'm trying to think through that funding and the mechanics of it. I believe the current funding is only through the end of this year. So if there are other funding options, would it then be the intent to bring those forward to the body to continue those services into 21, or are we looking at a gap?
Yeah, great question. Through the chair, Assembly Member Zalatel, I will take the first crack at it, and then if I get anything wrong, I'll ask Nicole to correct me. But no, we are not wanting to see any gap going into next year, and our intent would be to continue to fund our homelessness outreach with kind of the funding that Nicole described that we have received. But as she also said, to the extent that we can push any of the costs that, particularly in this area, again, into kind of the FEMA public assistance side, we will continue to do so. But we do not want to see any gap going into next year.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks. We had, when we set up the equity officer, we had an amendment there that said half of the cost would come from the alcohol tax. Yeah, and I don't see that here. And in the budget, the Equity and Justice Department is $190,976.
Through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton, I will have to go back and look at that because the way that that position is funded, it is actually, we funded it completely within the operating budget. But I will circle back with Lance to verify and ensure that we are funding it in the appropriate spot.
Okay, I'll email you the AO and all that business.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. I would love to see that as well. The email, I thought that we said not more than half would come from alcohol tax revenues, but I don't think it said the project must be funded by alcohol tax revenues.
Thank you. All right, I think Mr. Gates, you want to be at the end of the presentation. So go ahead, Mr. Buckenstead.
Okay. So this is the final slide. This is just everything. Again, I will email this around so that every member can have it.
I just related to that last slide.
Sure. So, Mr. Gates, we are getting loops. So if you can mute one of your devices, that would be helpful. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Well, so is this better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay.
Thank
you. Yeah, I'm sorry. It sort of was going to refer to the numbers on the last slide. So I have sort of a two-part comment question, and one is an important aspect of the ballot proposition and the alcohol tax was that all of these expenditures would be above the 2020 budget, which was the baseline. I think it would be helpful here, to show accountability for how this is all being spent, to have a column here showing what the 2020 baseline amount was for some of these items. And then, so that's one comment. And I guess a question to use as an example, some of these on this slide, we already have some of these services funded in the 2020 budget, if I remember right. And two examples are the library social worker. We have a position funded for that as a pilot project in the 2020 budget. And so this amount for the library social worker support, well, I guess this version it's gone, but similarly in the year-round camp abatement, 700,000 is in here, but I believe that we had in 2020 budgeted for was it 300, 600, 650,000? So does that mean now the total for that service is going to be about 1.3 million? And so I just want to make sure that we're complying with the ballot prop requirement to be above the 2020 baseline. And I guess you could say that a few other numbers here, but I'll stop there.
Through the chair, Mr. Gates, very well received comments. We can certainly provide kind of that additional column so that it is more clear. But to answer your second point, yes, all of these numbers are above and beyond kind of the 2020 baseline. So, for example, I believe you correctly identified the camp abatement piece. This number is above and beyond what is in there and would provide kind of year-round abatement. Currently, I believe we only really do about 6 months, maybe a little bit less than that. But it also includes the ability to store some of the property that we find at camps.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to add a little comment of mine is I don't see any issue with some of the services that have been funded with FEMA reimbursement funds or CARES Act funding. Those weren't part of the 2020 budget baseline. So when those are gone, I don't see an issue with the alcohol tax continuing those services that were funded by that federal money. So just to be clear, since that's mentioned a few times here and there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, please continue, Mr. Buckenstead.
Okay, so like I said, this is the last slide. It's just the starting slide. As you can see, the Assembly recommendation number when it came to us totaled about 13.2. I believe that we are estimating in the alcohol tax about 12.5, maybe a hair under 12.4 is the estimate for next year. The administration's recommendation came in significantly under that. Again, I think as I described, we knew that there was going to be the need to have some real conversations about what this looked like. And then the S version, based on a lot of the conversations that the administration, the Assembly, and others have had, brings the total amount to just over $12 million. So there's still some wiggle room in terms of what we're expecting to bring in and what we're proposing to expend, but that's all I had, and happy to answer any additional questions or just kind of listen in for the comment period that we'll have for the next little bit.
Thank you for the presentation. All right, now we're up to open discussion. Ms. Alatel.
Thanks. I do have a question, and it may be one that has to go back for an answer, but should we bring in significantly more alcohol tax funds in 2021 than we have allocated, will the alcohol tax just then run a fund balance going into 22? Obviously, first quarter won't be a significant difference just because of February implementation to April. So I'm just curious if it would run in that way, should the revenues be more than we've currently allocated.
Through the chair, Assembly Members Alato, you are exactly right. If in any given year we bring in more revenue than on the alcohol tax than is appropriated, it would create what you described as an alcohol tax fund balance. I think as, again, many of you will remember, when we pass this is a completely different fund. So it is not mixed in with the general government revenue. So we track it that way, and we will be able to track that. So if, say this is what we spend, but we bring in 12.5, there'll be roughly a $450,000 fund balance that is created going into 2022 that the administration and the Assembly preparing the 22 budget would be able to, fund one-time expenses or something else within these three broad buckets.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Well, thanks. Well, I guess I got the flip side of that. So perfect, Meg. What if we do not get $12 million? And, I wondered if maybe that has an impact here, but, if there were another column there that split it out so that some of these could be in the tentative column, so some of the grants perhaps, you put it in $1 million in one and $1 million in the other. And once we knew we had the alcohol taxes were coming on track to what we expected, then we could let go some of those other grants. I just hate to create expectations that we won't be able to fulfill.
Through the chair, Assemblymember Weddleton, again, I think that is a great point. It's I think it's likely smart. I think that's why we haven't gone all the way to the total amount that we're expecting, even with this S version proposal. And I think if you talk to Alex or our folks in Treasury, I think they would agree with that in terms of not necessarily maybe going all the way to the estimate, especially with a new tax that we don't have a lot of information on. I think after the first year, there'll be kind of a baseline that they will be able to really base a lot of their numbers on. And I think, as everyone is very well aware, our Treasury Department does an amazing job in really estimating the revenues of some of the different taxes and fees that we have. So I think from our perspective, the administration's perspective, it probably would be smart not to go all the way to the amount that they are initially expecting, at least in the first year. What that number is below, I think is open for conversation. You know, is $500,000 enough? Should it be $1 million? I think that is kind of where we should have some of these conversations.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to go back to the early education and early literacy grants. And I'm wondering if this is this programs that we're running through the library, or is this being coordinated through the school district, or is it some of both? Thank you.
I may actually phone a friend on this and see if Heather might know, or if there's a particular assembly member that I think has spent quite a bit more time on this. I believe that this was a proposal that was brought forth by a number of outside groups, during the process. But I believe it's a combination of everyone that you described, Assembly Member Peterson. But I'll let Heather or somebody else maybe shine a little bit more light on that.
Yes, so this was related to the early education grants. I might need to phone a friend as well. Just a moment. I'm not sure that we have an answer to that right now, but we are happy to look around and get any additional information that we can.
Okay, thank you. You can get back to me later. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. Is there any other discussion? Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to say thanks to the administration for the S version. I went back and dug up that wonderful document that maybe we've lost a little bit of track of during COVID, which was the assembly priorities. And these items really track well with a lot of the priorities we put forward to the public that we wanted, areas we wanted to tackle. And I think the way that the S version is put forward for the most part is fairly sustainable and leverages our funds with other opportunities in the community, either with philanthropy or other partners. So I just wanted to share those particular thoughts and trying to think about this work quite holistically within the context of the work we've done and the work we expressed that we wanted to do. And I think that the process that we went through to get to here is also reflected, that we did listen to a lot of individuals and groups with their ideas and their priorities. And I think overall, that process really paid off. As I've said before, I think the first budget of these funds is extremely important because we generally then start from a continuation posture. So I would just share that I'm fairly happy with this. I'm sure it will be tweaked, but I think it's reflective of the conversations this body's been having for over the last year. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other discussion or questions? I'm happy ending this work session early. All right, not seeing any, then I'll go ahead and close this work session. If there are additional changes folks want to make to this, we'll see them when we do budget amendments, have that work session on November 13th. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Bockenstead.
Thank you.
Thanks.